All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of the Rotman Graduate Student Conference. My name is Claire Valesha. I'm a first-year PhD student here. Our first speaker today is Philip Kieval from Cambridge University, presenting on unsupervised discoveries, understanding, and semantic opacity.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to talk a bit today about the role of machine learning in exploratory research and how I see the distinctive sort of epistemic character of machine learning systems as undermining scientific understanding in these sorts of contexts. So by way of a brief overview, so I'm going to talk a bit about a sort of parallel between data-driven science and exploratory experimentation in the philosophy of science. Move through like a very high level sort of primer on machine learning, and then talk a bit about opacity and its different sources, and then reflect a little bit about the relationship between all these issues and concept formation and scientific understanding. Then I'll wrap up. So I really want to sort of stress two sort of main claims. One is the idea that data-driven exploration with machine learning essentially aims to automate the processes of scientific discovery and concept formation, but that this is bound to fail in absence of human intervention, since the formation of new concepts is ultimately dependent on forms of practical and embodied understanding gained through systematic manipulation. And that what I'm tentatively calling semantic opacity means that we can't draw out intelligible semantic relationships between machine learning predictions and phenomenon of interest based on a model itself without prior and independent conceptualizations of the target. So my entry point here is data-driven science and what I take to be some of its characteristic methods and aims. So I should say a full characterization of what sets data-driven science apart is somewhat difficult to come by given the sort of diversity of epistemic activities involved. But I think we can give a sort of general characterization in terms of features that tend to factor into data-driven scientific practice. Some of these might include, for instance, the confluence of big data and new analytic techniques. Sabina Leonelli, for instance, emphasizes induction from large ensembles of data and automated forms of reasoning for extracting meaningful patterns from these data sets. And I think crucially, what's important to point out is that big data is not just about the volume and velocity at which data is produced, but I think has to do with the ways of practices of data collection analysis are detached from specific research hypotheses or questions. And this is, I think, often somewhat misguidedly led to characterizations of new data-driven methodologies as theory agnostic or hypothesis neutral. Now, in this sense, I think data-driven science shares a sort of common methodological core with exploratory experimentation as distinguished from theory-driven experiments in the philosophy of science. So in philosophy of science, exploration has been recognized as sort of distinct form of experimentation and one that is not strongly guided by theory. Such experiments typically occurs in contexts as Friedrich Steinel puts it, no well-formed conceptual framework is available or regarded as reliable. And I think exploration occurs really when our theoretical background just simply doesn't provide clear expectations of what fundamental things inquirers will tend to find. And instead, exploratory experiments vary parameters of a system widely with an eye towards observing regularities, generating novel findings, and developing new concepts. And the final aim of such broad, wide experimentation is to sort of reconfigure and reconceive anew the fundamental objects of our theories and the rules governing their behavior. So exploratory experiments essentially aimed at the expansion of existing frameworks or the generation of entirely new concepts. And I think arguably data-driven science, at least in some of its forms takes this same sort of form of exploration, and it emphasizes, as I said, automated forms of reasoning to extract patterns and generate new concepts where no existing theory is deemed authoritative. And I also think this parallel in some sense suggests a possible normative standard against which we might judge the likely success or failure of particular methodologies. That is, when they're likely to sort of put us in a position where we can actually develop new findings and expand our sort of conceptual frameworks in this way. In some sense, this amounts to offloading cognitive labor of discovery to machines. So I think the sort of demonstrable successes of machine learning have galvanized a sense of optimism that we might fully automate this process of exploration and discovery. For instance, this prominent neuroscientist, Nancy Kanwisher here, notably sort of articulates this when she says, if we proceed by testing only the categories which seem plausible to us, then we risk getting trapped within the confines of our own preconceptions. And her sort of proposed solution invokes the use of machine learning and other data-driven techniques to circumvent human biases by searching for structure in the brain, for instance, in a quote, hypothesis neutral fashion. Now, the problem as I see it is that given these exploratory aims, machine learning systems and extant methods of explaining their predictions are in some sense unsuitable or unfit for purpose for producing the kinds of understanding that grounds the formation of new concepts. And I also think this invites some sustained philosophical reflection on the relationship between understanding and concept formation in the context of scientific exploration and discovery. So a brief sort of primer on machine learning. So machine learning is, broadly speaking, a subfield of computer science, which aims to engineer systems that acquire their own solutions to problems. So the kinds of learning strategies are implemented typically by artificial neural networks, loosely inspired by the structure and function of the brain. And these typically look something like this. Probably everybody's seen a diagram that looks something like this at some point by now. Basically, you have a series of you have one input layer that has a series of nodes that passes signal from input to a series of hidden layers, and then through these weighted connections passes the signal forward through the network into produce an output at the output layer. And crucially, learning is basically just a form of optimization, where the goal is to maximize some objective function or minimize error. So in this sense, an error function represents how error signal varies with changes in the values of the parameters of the model. And crucially, the parameters of this function are what it takes as arguments are essentially just inputs and the weights and biases between nodes in the network. And this is optimization is typically done through an algorithm called gradient descent, usually stochastic gradient descent. So this works basically by computing what's called a gradient, which is just a vector containing all the partial derivatives of all the parameters of the error function. And this basically indicates how infinitesimally small changes in the model's parameters will elicit corresponding changes in error signal. A sort of simple analogy for sort of grokking how this works. So you might imagine that the error function as sort of a vast topological landscape. And you might imagine you're sort of like Bear Grylls over here, and you've been sort of helicoptered into a random point on this landscape. And the sort of goal of optimizing, in a sense, is to minimize error, right? So you want to get to the lowest point of elevation possible. But now imagine that you're blindfolded while you're doing this. So what you sort of might think to do is sort of feel the slope of the landscape around you and find the direction in which it slopes downwards, and then sort of take tentative steps in that direction. And then if you start sloping up again, then you might, look around and find another direction and keep sort of iteratively testing different directions until you get further and further down until you can't go any further because all directions around you will be sloping upwards. And so then you'll sort of terminate the learning process. But there is an important sort of disanalogy here in the sense that this type of process is going to be very, very high dimensional because all the dimensionality of this is going to basically correspond to the number of weights in the network, which could be like tremendously high, like perhaps even like billions in the case of large language models. And I also want to sort of get a further distinction on the board. Basically, this is the distinction between supervised and unsupervised learning. And for our purposes, the main point of contrast is the following. Basically, in a supervised task, training data are labeled. And so the model learns to sort new data into predefined classes based on human assigned labels. Whereas unsupervised models group together data based on the informational structures encountered during training, and they do so automatically without antecedently assigned labels to the data. And for the remainder, I'm going to focus on unsupervised learning, since I think it generally sort of has nice parallels to this sort of exploratory context that I've been talking about already. So what exactly is at issue here? So as you may know, many machine learning systems are black boxes that do not explain their predictions in a way that human reasoners can understand. And this sort of black box problem occurs when a system is opaque. So we can sort of follow Paul Humphreys here in saying that a process is epistemically opaque relative to a cognitive agent at some time, just in case that cognitive agent does not know at that time all of the epistemically relevant elements of a process. And I think sort of growing awareness of the consequences of opacity in machine learning have brought about attention to explainable AI, or XAI, which is just a research program that broadly aims to explain how these systems make decisions and predictions. And this is like generally focused on developing what are called post hoc analytic techniques for interpretability. And I suggest that one way we can sort of understand these techniques is as tools for functional explaining, as Wilkenfeld calls it. So I've sort of come up with like sort of a modified definition of Wilkenfeld's functional explaining, where we might say an analytic technique explains a system to an audience if and only if it produces a representation that, when properly internalized, causes improved understanding of that system in the audience. And these types of explanations are typically sort of non-factive, reason-giving or intentional stance explanations that aim to answer sort of how and why questions about how a model is making particular decisions in a particular instance. Now, what's important to note here is that many discussions of opacity with respect to machine learning and science also concern what it's essentially complexity-based opacity. So this is opacity issuing from the sheer complexity of the process in the face of human inquirers' limited cognitive resources. But this form of opacity, I think, is continuous with other forms of computational techniques, for instance, computer simulation. Now, notably, however, simulations address opacity sort of directly via this sort of iterative calibration process, right? So we might, so essentially all simulations start at some point with an idealized mathematical model or conceptualization of the target system, usually in the form of, for instance, like differential equations, and we can sort of calibrate the outputs of the system against known sources of error, particularly because the parameters of the simulation are semantically interpretable in light of the prior conceptualization of the target system. I think this stresses an important sense in which machine learning systems are like totally unlike other scientific models. So the parameters of a machine learning system are reflexive in the sense that they pick out features of the model itself rather than the target system. So I think like on pretty much any definition of scientific models, what's key to the use of models in scientific instant inferences is the fact that the scientific models consist in an interpreted structure that we can use to represent real or imagined phenomena. And it's only through our ability to interpret a model structure in light of properties of a conceptualized target that we can successfully use the model in our inferential practices. So I think this sort of brings about this problem, which is that machine learning systems really are more akin to non-parametric statistical methods than models. So machine learning systems lack any clear semantically interpretable mappings between their parameters and the features of target systems, whether real or imagined. And their parameters instead correspond to a learned set of weights. So they depict the model itself. And in this sense, the machine learning systems lack meaningfulness in the form of intelligible semantic relations between their predictions and the physical systems they make predictions about. So this gives rise to what I'm, as I said, tentatively calling semantic opacity, which occurs when we're unable to interpret the meanings of predictive patterns in data exploited by a machine learning system owing to this disconnect between the system's parameters and the target phenomena underlying said data patterns. And basically our ability to make predictions comes apart from our capacity to draw out intelligible semantic relations between those predictions and the phenomenon of interest. And understanding the predictions of a machine learning system at all seems to require, in some sense, of sophisticated prior conceptualization of both input and output, which, as I sort of suggested before, is precluded in exploratory contexts. So by way of an example, we might think of dimensionality reduction, which involves sort of reducing the number of variables required to accurately describe and subsequently visualize very high dimensional data. So this image comes from MNIST, which is a sort of benchmark handwritten digit data set. And you can see this is a unsupervised dimensionality reduction technique that sort of yields a nice, pretty looking scatter plot that roughly matches what we would expect this very sort of high dimensional data set to look in 2 dimensions. So this often gets applied in single cell genomics research. Basically, investigators want to answer some fundamental questions about which gene regulatory mechanisms support the processes by which individual cells differentiate and form tissues. But this process isn't totally well understood, and there's lots of gaps in our knowledge, particularly about how RNA sequencing relates to gene expression and the formation of various tissues by way of differentiating into different cell subtypes. And so what often happens is we will use these sort of unsupervised dimensionality reduction techniques to generate a sort of low dimensional clustering patterns, and then investigators will sort of assign biological interpretations to the output clusters. And sometimes they might discover like novel clusters that they didn't expect to be there. And this sort of gets interpreted as a discovery of a putative new cell subtype that was previously sort of undetected. However, it's important to note that these systems are actually quite unreliable, and there's a sort of known sort of error or defect in that they can often yield sort of spurious clustering that are based merely in artifacts in the data sets. And so some research has recently brought attention to this problem. And here we have, this is from a recent review where the authors suggest that we should take serious caution in assigning biological interpretations to the clustering patterns that are the result of dimensionality reduction, without any sort of theoretical guarantee that their interpretations are actually like meaningful in any way. So essentially, what I'm suggesting here is that anomalous clusters sort of fail this test of meaningfulness because they can't be put into semantic relations with other features of the phenomenon without us already having a sort of prior conceptualization of what's going on. And furthermore, I think post hoc sort of reason giving or intentional stance explanations might be good at addressing how and why questions, but they're not really sort of well poised to address semantic opacity because they assume that we already possess meaningful concepts of both input and output. And when we don't have concepts of the input and output structure, these types of like sort of non-factive explanations are going to be sort of not very helpful for us. So as I say, they sort of elucidate a conceptualization of the input-output structure, but this is going to be unhelpful when we're dealing with semantic opacity and exploratory science. As I said, this sort of invites some reflection on the relationship between understanding and concepts, basically. So it seems like the situation I've been discussing undermines scientific understanding, but how exactly? So I think spelling out how concepts contribute to understanding is actually quite tricky because we often invoke concepts and understanding sort of coextensively in ordinary use. So for example, even sort of minimally understanding what a cell is seems to imply that I possess a concept of cells. So teasing these apart is actually quite difficult. So Michael Stewart proposes meaningfulness, I think, described in terms of our ability to draw out and use semantic relationships between new and old ideas as a sort of operational test of understanding. And I think we can sort of build on this by saying something to the effect that meaningful scientific concepts are like tools for framing future inquiry and for relating new experimental results to our antecedent ideas and theories and experiences. And fitting new findings to concepts requires us to perform interpretive actions that can often be blocked off by semantic opacity. So I suggest this is exactly how semantic opacity undermines understanding in this way. Now, getting a bit back to exploratory experiments and exploration more broadly, new scientific concepts are, as I've suggested, formed through this process of exploration of widely varying parameters of a system and sort of observing regularities and patterns. But their meaningfulness of these new concepts is often, I think, grounded in our practical abilities that are derived from systematic manipulation. And when we sort of offload the cognitive labor of exploration in these data-driven contexts to machines, we can these can sort of only at best direct our attention towards avenues for future exploratory experimentation and manipulation. So without, I think, like systematic human intervention, we're not actually going to be able to assign meaningful interpretations to sort of outputs of these systems in exploratory contexts. So I'll sort of conclude here. What exactly is going on? So machine learning predictions, as I've suggested, can't tell us what they mean on their own. Interpreting their meaning is essentially the job of human inquirers. And doing so requires a degree of meaningfulness operationalized in terms of our ability to draw out and use semantic relationships between new and old ideas. And semantic opacity, as I've outlined, means that without a prior conceptualization of the target system, we can't fit machine learning predictions to meaningful concepts. And thus, when we lean on machine learning to generate novel findings, we lose out on the kind of understanding that is integral to establishing new concepts through these processes of exploration. Yeah, thank you very much.
right. Thank you so much. So we'll start the Q&A off. If anyone has any questions. Okay.
Hi, thank you very much for that presentation. It was awesome. The questions that I have, so I'm really into exploratory research. So my questions, I have maybe like 3 questions, and they're a little bit, not fully developed, and they're a little abstract. But I was just wondering if you can go back to slide 18, and so it's kind of where you start talking about ML systems lacking meaningfulness in the form of intelligence. And so I just here you talked about something in terms of non-parametrically, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that first.
Yeah. So I sort of suggested very briefly that machine learning systems are sort of more akin to non-parametric statistical methods rather than models. I think the sort of parallel here is that, so like with non-parametric statistics, the sort of what really separates them from like classical statistical methods is this idea that you don't have to make like strong antecedent like modeling assumptions, like fitting the data to a particular distribution. You can just like throw, this is, I mean, obviously oversimplifying, but you can sort of throw a lot of data at it without making strong theoretical assumptions about how the data is distributed. And I think like machine learning in some sense is just like the sort of natural next step in the evolution of statistical methods, where we've sort of throughout the history of statistics developed methods that increasingly rely on fewer and fewer assumptions about the sort of systems that we're modeling. Yeah, hopefully that.
Okay, so that's more clear for me. So then, but then like on the next slide, on slide 19, where you talk about dimensionality reduction. So here you say that it involves reducing the number of variables required to accurately provide a description. So here I'm wondering, like, is this not parametrically adjusting experimental conditions? Like, is there a clear distinction there?
Yeah, it depends, right? Because there's lots of different dimensionality reduction techniques. So some like principal component analysis might be doing just that, but like I'm thinking here about techniques that are broadly getting applied in these contexts, which tend to be things like TSNE and UMAP, which are like unsupervised sort of machine learning techniques, where basically they work like they're sort of undirected graph networks, and they take these big high dimensional data sets, and they have some loss function that determines how they're going to map like nearest neighbor structure basically to a low dimensional projection of a high dimensional data set. And so it's not so much that it's like isolating like principal components or anything like that. It's generating a new structure in a different dimensionality based on a particular learning algorithm. Yeah. Okay. I can say more.
No, that's great. That answers my questions. And then secondly, so I know in the literature that's out there, hypothesis testing and exploratory experiments are mostly like indirectly spoken of, but I'm kind of sensing that in your presentation today. So I'm wondering like if there is a role for hypothesis testing in your research here.
Yeah. So I guess I focus on this parallel to exploratory experimentation and data-driven science, because the idea is that we don't have a sort of authoritative theory that is going to tell us what to expect from experiments. So like Friedrich Steinel draws on the history of like electromagnetism, where you had people like Ampere and Michael Faraday who are sort of like fumbling around with their little instruments, and they didn't really have a theory of electromagnetism, so they had no idea what was going on at first. And through this process of like setting up more and more precise experimental systems, and then sort of manipulating through trial and error and observing all the different sort of regularities, they sort of formulated new concepts that were generative and producing new theories. And I think this isn't to say that like, so in this literature, there's still like a role for theory, but it's almost always in the background. So it's things like, in the case of like cell biology, things like, well, obviously there's like tons of theoretical work that goes into developing instruments for measuring and collecting the data. And there's sort of background theories about like how RNA works to regulate, sort of proteins and gene expression. But like what the difference is, like in these types of experiments and analysis routines, like the investigators aren't necessarily like testing predictions in the strict sense of like we have a hypothesis of what we're going to expect, and we're going to do some experiments, and then we're going to confirm or disconfirm our hypothesis. It's more like we're just collecting a ton of data, and we're going to see what comes out of it.
Right. Okay, cool. So I have one more last question, and I'll let somebody else question. So forgive me for asking this because I'm not familiar with this literature, but could you explain more explicitly what the difference between this new notion of semantic opacity is from like the common notion?
Yeah. So the idea is that opacity, as it's discussed in the literature going back at least to Humphreys in his sort of influential 2009 paper, is chiefly about the complexity of these sort of computational processes. So in that paper, he actually talks not about machine learning, but about simulations. And he just says, look, like, we take a, simulation where we have a computer program that sort of algorithmically iteratively solves differential discretized versions of differential equations, and it's doing so like really, really quickly, and there's super complex equations that it's solving over and over and over again to produce like predictions or like visual simulations of the target phenomenon. And like this is really difficult for human reasoners to understand just because it's so complex. And I think people in the machine learning literature have sort of latched onto this idea because machine learning systems are really complex. And that makes it really difficult for us to understand how, how exactly it's using data to generate predictions, because we don't know what features in the data set are like salient exactly, or whether it's tracking real sort of causal properties of the phenomenon that we're interested in. And so this has led to the sort of the development of techniques that basically aim to sort of make salient features of the data that the system is using to make predictions. And that's great, but what I suggest is that if we're in a predicament where we don't really have an authoritative conceptualization of the target system, as is the case in some exploratory contexts, then because the parameters of machine learning systems actually refer to the machine learning system itself rather than the target system, as in the case of simulations or other types of traditional scientific models, then we're not in a like sort of position to make meaningful like inferences about the target system, because by looking at the model itself, because the sort of parameters just refer to the model and not the target system at all. And so the only way we can sort of get understanding out of machine learning systems is if we already have this antecedent conceptualization of the input output structure. In a sense, like we have to know like what kinds of patterns in the structure of the sort of phenomena that we're interested in making predictions about. And if we don't have that sort of rich enough conceptualization of the target system, then we can't really make principled inferences based on the predictions of a machine learning model, unless we like go back and like get better knowledge of the target system, basically, which is what we were hoping that the machine learning system would do in the first place. So you sort of end up in this, sort of epistemic circularity in a way.
Great, thank you so much. Does anyone else have a question? And then we'll go over here.
See, Bill has been patiently waiting.
Hi, so I just kind of want to pick up on sort of the thread you were going on just now. And I apologize if I'm trying to formulate this in a way that doesn't just make it sound like I'm like a shithead skeptic about it, because I think it's worth considering. But you're talking about the process, I guess, of regular exploratory science would be that, you sort of throw a data set in, that doesn't really have sort of like a priori assumptions, and you sort of look for the patterns there, and then maybe you sort of go down that path and follow those patterns and eventually formulate a concept. And so the issue there is that the machine learning system is the one that is recognizing the patterns and following that path as opposed to a person. And I'm wondering why we should privilege our own concept of salience or like our own recognition of patterns in the system over what a machine is doing. And I sort of think about this because I know that like especially in the concept of something like neuroscience, that sometimes those sort of paths are wrong or do sort of produce these like wild theories that don't really make a lot of sense. And so it seems like there's a lot resting on like the scientist's ability to do that better than what a machine can do. And I'm just wondering, yeah, why?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I think gets to like some deep issues. So the way that I see it is that at least as it's been discussed in the literature on exploration, what is grounding the sort of the development of these new concepts is the fact that we're like systematically manipulating the target, and like we're intervening and doing things and finding difference makers, right? But machine learning is not doing that, right? It just sort of takes a bunch of data and spits out an output, and there's a sort of black box in the middle. And so I don't mean to suggest that like that's never going to be helpful, or that on the other hand that human scientists are always going to be like great at sometimes they'll come up with wacky explanations for like particular effects of manipulation, but I hopefully that gets smoothed out in the course of investigation eventually. But I guess the key difference, right, is that I think there's something really crucial about the sort of embodied and practical knowledge that comes with actually intervening. So I mean, picking up on threads, of people like Ian Hacking and early American pragmatists as well. Like there, and I think Sabina Leonelli also picks up on similar ideas when she talks about like the sort of work that like metadata like curating is doing. Is like trying to systematically encode embodied knowledge into data sets, and that's really crucial for like getting understanding. So I think in general the sort of main distinction is where with machine learning you sort of have this you just have an input output structure, and you can't sort of make inferences about the sort of workings of the system itself based on the machine learning system itself. whereas in actual like experimental practice, we, do the work of intervening and, seeing what, real difference makers are and what aren't difference makers. And in that sense, we can pick up on like meaningful patterns and stable regularities and sort of reconfigure our theories in ways that we can't when we're dealing with a black box.
All right, thank you. Yes, Heather, go for it. Thank you for your talk. It's weird not being able to see you. I also have like a follow-up question on that. But first, I just want to say thanks for like bringing out that similarity between machine learning methods and exploratory experiments and this sort of domain generality that's important there. I'm also really interested in this field. So kind of just going back to the last question, actually, I just want to push a little bit on that. If we could maybe like revisit the idea of like post-hoc analyses and saliency analyses and functional understanding and pragmatic understanding that we can get from the model after the fact. And I just wonder if this is like a new way of doing science, in that we're getting that manipulation and that intervening after the fact, after we have the trained model. And I know you said that like we have to have a really high conceptualization of input and output in order to make sense of that. But I wonder too, like if we're seeing this as too much of an all or nothing, where our concepts have to be either like fully blown or we don't have any understanding at all, and what we get from the model we won't understand at all. Whereas like in exploratory work, there could be some understanding going on. Like we might have some concepts that are not fully blown, but so we do bring that prior understanding to our work when we perform these post-hoc analyses, but it may still be not fully fledged as a theory yet in this exploratory area. And like, so wouldn't it be better than nothing, I guess is what I'm saying, to have this output from the model, right? Saying, oh, I found these two things that are similar. Maybe you should look at them further. Maybe this will spur some further understanding that leads to a radical shift. And actually, that's kind of my second question is, I'm wondering if you've read Florian Boge's recent work on this, and if so, he doesn't actually exclude the possibility of deep learning leading to radical conceptual shifts, like radical even paradigm changes where the background theory changes. Though he says like, okay, we should have the right set of geniuses to be around and we shouldn't really expect that to happen. But at the same time, like, isn't that what happens when we have radical conceptual shifts in normal scientific practice? We have the right set of geniuses around and that leads to a radical conceptual shift. So again, this could accelerate the process because we have a starting point, right? We have like things that the model treats as similar that we should look at in these massive data sets. So it's helping our, the automation is helping us with efficiency and like the previous person said, like even just in seeing things differently than we would based on our evolutionary history. So, and then I have a last question, but I think we could take that offline. I'm just really interested to talk to you more about some technical questions about unsupervised learning and how validation happens there. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Actually, I think we're like actually pretty much totally in alignment on this. And this is still work in progress, so I'm still sort of fleshing out where to go from here. But I think you're exactly right that, and this is sort of what I suggest at the end, is that, these types of systems might point us in the direction of like a useful future inquiry where we can actually like, we can say like, okay, look, it's picking up on some patterns and now we can like go and actually do some like, actual interventions and see if those patterns are actually real difference makers or if they're just artifacts, that sort of thing. So I think that's totally right. I haven't read the Boge paper, but it's on my to-do list actually. Yeah, I mean, another way I was sort of toying with going is that really as you said, I think this can be sort of graded, right? So we might have like our sort of theoretical background could be more or less impoverished, right? And so like the less impoverished it is, the safer our sort of inferences might be, or like the better positioned we might be to make meaningful interpretations of like output clusters. But I think this puts us in sort of like a maybe like inductive risks territory where it's like, you know, what's the sort of risk of being wrong? What's the risk of error? And that's the sort of direction that I've toyed with. Yeah, but I think in general, I think we're totally in alignment on this. So thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Bill, do you want to go next?
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Now, I think it might be very useful to explore the differences that are going on in the great success that was done with machine applications to DNA patterns. And there, now this is not something I know enough details about, but I suspect that many of the things that you're saying are real problems for this more general exploratory thing are being, there's enough constraints characterizing the input-output in that case. And it might be very useful to just compare that case with the problem of just trying to do it everywhere.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to have like, I guess the suggestion is to have a really nice contrast case where it's like similar methodology, but there are enough constraints on the methods such that we can actually get really concrete understanding, and then that'll sort of bring out the nice contrast where with more exploratory situations where we might not be able to get the same understanding. So that's really helpful, and I'll definitely look into that.
Thanks. I mean, it is that's sort of trotted out as the big success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good.
All right, do we have any other questions? Thanks for this really interesting talk. I wanted to ask you just to work through a bit more fully for me, or maybe just rehearse what you've already said, from kind of moving from the point of semantic opacity and the kind of general formulation of what the concern is to focusing specifically on concept formation. And the reason I ask is that this might be wrong, but concept formation sort of connotes to me a focus on what comes to mind to say is the focus on what, right? What's there, and our lack of meaningfulness, our lack of ability to sort of make meaningful connections for our existing theoretical framework to the what. But then your focus on patterns and contrast with types of science where scientists can do interventions seems to suggest to me that the concern might be, at least in part or maybe in large part, instead with sort of our inability, or our scientists' inability with this particular scientific work to draw sort of into our theoretical framework, existing theoretical framework, the connections that are found. And so I wonder if you could address that a bit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think the first thing that you said is totally right. Totally what I'm trying to get at here, right, is that in cases of like sort of data-driven exploration, we can be in this sort of epistemic situation where the what of phenomena is not understood, right? So we don't actually know what it is that we're observing. because we don't have a sort of authoritative theory that tells us what we're observing. And so how we get from there to like talk of like patterns and regularities. Well, I mean, I think in general, like scientific concepts are not sort of like, timeless entities, right? So like there are things that we make through the process of inquiry and that are stabilized and like articulated in the course of history via, processes of discovery, which often involve lots of like rigorous and like difficult work done by lots of people. And so like part of this process involves, starting with a situation where our concepts might be impoverished and we don't really know what to expect as the sort of entities that we get as the sort of products of our experimental methods. But through a sort of long, sort of arduous process of manipulation and observation, we can sort of pick out the patterns and stable regularities and sort of describe and articulate new concepts of like what it is that we're observing on the basis of those regularities and patterns. Yeah, hopefully that's helpful. That's sort of the idea that, or sort of line of thought that I'm following here.
All right, well, if there aren't any further questions, we'll wrap up and go on a quick break until 11:15. Thank you so much for this presentation. And
yeah, thank you all. It's really helpful.